keep it simple.
Wonderful technology.
Yeah. So I imagine they'll kind of place this. I don't know if it'll stay right in front of you, but
Well, I don't mind.
don't be intimidated by it.
I'm what is called a lens louse. I like camera phone.
Great. Oh, that's good to know.
What was her last name?
Irina.
Irina. Okay.
Irina, yeah.
Yeah. I thought she had already asked her to take like one or two pictures for me.
Oh no, of course we always do. So I brought my phone as well. We could take it with your phone too if you
Yeah. Well,
want.
actually, I have a camera.
Okay, sure.
Oh, you have a camera.
Yeah, I know. That's
Well, I found that it takes just the same amount of pictures.
I know. That's why I just use my phone. But yeah, I can do that.
My daughter got it for me for my birthday. She's a big camera buff, so I always promised to get it.
Mm-hmm. A big camera. Yeah. It looked like in St. Petersburg you went to mainly international relations
Right,
groups. Yeah.
right, exactly. And last night we went to environmental. Well, not last night. Yesterday afternoon we went to an environmental group, and it's a joint environmental group and American Studies. It's
Mm.
kind of interesting. I didn't even know that Petersburg State had a good American Studies program, but
Mm.
there was a
Mm-hmm.
professor of American Studies.
Yeah. Was it Ivan Kurila?
No, it was Natalia.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember her last name.
Mm. Yeah, there's not a lot in Russia, and I know there's been like two regional American States professors that have been kind of kicked out of their cities and forced to resign, and they've moved to St. Petersburg, and now are working there. And one of them is Ivan Kurila. That's how I know him. He's been in the press.
Yeah, there was another one there. I don't know.
It might have been him. He's very active.
It might have been him. Yeah, because he was very good. He asked some very good questions, and he obviously had a small amount of background.
Yeah, he's kind of younger.
Yeah, yeah,
Probably was him.
yeah. I didn't get his name though, but Natalia was the host. So.
Mm-hmm.
How have things been here in terms of morale?
Well, I mean, our staff is used to it. They're really resilient. But I know right before I came, two local staff were forced to resign for reasons. Whenever we travel, they kind of give us a hard time. Some of our speakers in the past have been like taken in by immigration court and sent out of the country. That's why we had to do humanitarian visas, just so you have protection that you come on the right visa. Otherwise, they can target you if you're just on a tourist visa. But
So what was the tourist visa?
no, back then, I guess they were on tourist visas, so they were targeted that way.
Like my visa is on
Yours is humanitarian. Yeah.
Excuse me, can you look at the schedule of our speakers?
Yeah.
If I can tell actually who's dates.
Yeah.
Because they have a lot of activities during June.
Yeah.
Looking at the speakers and time for
Computers. His are, but that's St. Petersburg first. The dates are
if you can look at them because they have full schedule all June. Only a few days are available.
yeah.
Not for Steven.
Not available for him.
Not available this time until 11th November. So going forward in June.
This is actually the schedule of one we have and then choose in between. This is Jai. He grew up there, but he lived in Philadelphia as well, and he was born in Canada. Actually, he's American, but his parents were American. He was just happened to be born there.
Yeah, I have relatives in Canada. They were called in the 1924 U.S. Church celebration. Established borders. And then so they were called in.
That's where he was born.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So maybe he knows some family.
Yeah. Because his dad was teaching at a university there in the early 70s.
Maybe he worked there.
Yeah. It's a very small town.
Yeah. Yeah, it was funny. Speaking of being related, my father's in the family of 9 kids. Cousins and aunts and uncles. His oldest, 7 years ago, was out in San Diego at a party. Turns out they were engaged. That ended that.
Don't blink in your camera.
They're still on.
Yeah.
Usually we start within 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, 1 minute is fine.
Okay.
Don't go. It's
Yeah, that's fine. Just a couple.
this is the art office. This is the
Okay.
actually I'll judge you after the class.
Right, okay. I'll take some of my notes.
And I will just invite you to sit here because the camera is
Sit here.
working. Yeah. So
Okay,
that,
great. Sure.
there's some nice streaming. I don't know if you can talk to you. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, oh, no, it's fine.
And then we
Yeah,
post it. It will be posted on YouTube. Which yourself. Well, we kind of promote it. Good evening. We will be starting. Thank you for coming. And on behalf of the Graduate School of Urbanism, I will welcome you here on a regular Wednesday night at the library. I'm happy to introduce our guest today, David Goldfield, who came all the way from the US to be with us here today. Interestingly, we've had in this venue a lot of urban planners, urban thinkers, urban geographers, sociologists, economists, but I think it's the first time that we have an urban historian with us and an urban writer, which I think it might be the right way to present you, David. I don't know if you'd agree with that. David is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, who has written a lot of books on cities, and I think a few of them were nominated for Pulitzer Prize, which is an incredible achievement, as we know. David is also editor of the Journal of Urban History, right? Is that what it's called? Which is quite fascinating too. And so today, David will be talking about his favorite subjects, which is cities, American cities, but not just cities, green cities. And as you know, cities are constantly growing, and the 20th century has seen an incredibly rapid urbanization, which is still going on. And about half of the population of the world is now living in the cities. In developed countries, that goes up to 70–80%, and obviously this figure is going to continue to increase. And cities contribute to a lot of environmental problems as they consume a lot of energy. About 80% of the world energy is consumed by cities. and it's not just industries. It's our lifestyles. It's electricity, cooling, heating, all the wonderful gadgets that we use, and being major contributors to world environmental problems. It's only obvious that cities must also try and respond to those challenges in a responsible way. And I think David today is going to tell us about American experience and how cities in the US have been active in trying to respond to sustainability issues. Um, Using this lecture as an opportunity, I would like to announce a cycle of lectures that is starting next Friday on the subject of sustainability. The cycle is called Green City, quite conveniently and coincidentally, but it's not about American cities, it's green cities in general. It's part of the Eco Festival that is going today, and there'll be a cycle of 6 lectures in the Schuchov Lab, which is our other venue of the Graduate School of Urbanism, Mysnitska Street, at the High School of Economics. They will start at 7 o'clock, and the first lecture in the cycle is this Friday, which is called Count Your Water Print. How much water do we have left? So I have a few poorly cut leaflets here, and I invite you to take them and attend those events as well. And last but not least, I'm very grateful to the US Embassy who made David's visit possible, and we have Kim there with us modestly at the back, who has been the main driving force behind this visit, and we appreciate this partnership a lot, and we hope that there will be more exciting lectures to come. Here's to you, David. The floor is yours, and hopefully there'll be some time for Q&A at the end.
There will. Thank you very much, Vera. That was a perfect introduction because it leads right into exactly what I am going to talk about tonight. If we are going to have a clean planet for everyone to live in, we must have clean cities, because the movement to cities is one of the great migrations of the 21st century, as it was for the 20th century. So I would like to thank Vera and you for coming, for the invitation to be here in this wonderful space surrounded by books. And also I would like to thank Kim Scrivener and her colleagues at the U.S. Embassy here in Moscow. The difficulty in the U.S. is that we live under a federal system of government, which means that the federal government does not have the power to make laws for states and cities necessarily, but it gives an opportunity for states and cities to make their own laws. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is not so good. But when we have a presidential administration that includes a considerable number of people who deny that there is such a thing as climate change, then initiatives by states and cities in the U.S. become much more important. So let us begin. And I'm not going to take off all my clothes, just my jacket. Okay. Actually, concern about the environment has been something that have concerned cities since the country began. But as people began to move to cities in the early 19th century, epidemic diseases began to wipe out significant portions of the urban population. And in New York City in 1832 and again in 1837, there were significant outbreaks of cholera. And cholera is the type of disease that usually follows from impure water. And as cities became more crowded, city leaders were concerned that it would hurt the economy of the city. People would not come to their city if their city was unhealthy. So, as a result, they developed policies to clean up the city and make the city more healthful. But, and here's the problem, the scientific knowledge of the time was unclear as to exactly how we can make cities better environments. There was a theory that there was something in the air of crowded cities that made people sick. So if we expand the air, if we have more space for the air to circulate, if we have more space for the air to circulate, then in that case, we can have a more healthful city. So what happened was, cities began to look at open spaces. And here we have the first attempt at open spaces in cities in the city of Boston in New England, in the northeast of the United States. And what city planners did in 1840 was to transform a cemetery, Mount Auburn Cemetery, as you see here, into a park. This, unfortunately, was not a good strategy because while you were burying your Uncle Fred, there were people having picnics, playing ball, and the atmosphere of the cemetery as a place of mourning, peace, and tranquility ended. So that was not a good alternative. What was a good alternative was to create a park just as a park. So New York City hired Frederick Law Olmsted, a landscape architect in the 1850s, to design a large park in the city. This was very controversial. Well, why was a park controversial? Well, because trees and grass and animals do not pay taxes. And if you are going to build a city and invite people to come, build businesses, housing, other economic enterprises, industry, you want to generate income from the land. But if you turn land over to a park, you're not getting anything. Anything. But the argument was made that in the long run, and believe me, politicians never think in the long run, in the long run, it will pay for itself. How? It will make the city healthier, it will make workers happier, and it will make the city more attractive for people to come in and build their lives and the life of the city as well. So there was a compromise. And the compromise was that Frederick Law Olmsted would build his park where nobody lived in Manhattan at the time. That is, he would start what today is 59th Street and could extend the park to 102nd Street, a massive square block of territory where no one lived. And in fact, no one lived within 2 miles of Central Park. So the feeling was that, maybe sometime in the 21st century, that area will be filled and people will have better access to the park, but in the meantime, we won't lose any revenue since nobody's going to live there anyway. Well, of course, as we know, Central Park is indeed central. It's right smack in the middle of Manhattan today. And it is a great attraction. It is the lungs of New York City. And it's one of the reasons why New York City today, for a city its size, has relatively clean air. So the urban park movement was one of the most important innovations in the 19th century, which established the principle that open space is good for the environment, it's good for health, and it is good for business. I mention this last point particularly because there is an idea among policymakers, particularly in the current administration in the US, that somehow environmental regulations are antagonistic toward economic development and business. It is the opposite. A second problem in the city, in addition to bad air, is bad water. Because after all, cholera is a disease that comes from drinking impure water. So how do you get good water into the city? Well, New York tried to dig wells, but that didn't work because the wells soon became contaminated. So they went upstate New York to the Catskill Mountains, and there was a beautiful river flowing through those mountains called the Hudson River, discovered by Henry Hudson several hundred years earlier. And the water was clean and pure. And New York City decided that they will build pipes and ducts to carry that water, because fortunately you did not require any pumping action, because the mountains, water flows downhill, as we all know. The mountains provided the gravity to transfer the water into the city. And to this day, this is how New York City gets its water. And New York City has the finest water in America. It's the only major municipal water system that does not chlorinate the water. Most water systems put in chlorine to get rid of some of the germs, some of the parasites. Chlorine is not dangerous per se, although if you drink too much of it, it is, and it doesn't taste that great. But in New York, you don't need it. So if you go to New York City, you can walk into your hotel room, open the tap, and just take a nice big drink of water. And you can see here, these viaducts still exist in New York, by the way. Now, I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if it's possible to lower these lights or take some of the lights off. We can make it more romantic here. Well, maybe that's too romantic. If we could have the backlights, yeah, that's good. Is this good for you all? Okay, good, good. Uh, but a new problem emerged after the American Civil War in the 1860s, and that was the fact that America underwent an industrial revolution. And two major industries that did not exist before the war suddenly appeared. One was the oil industry, and the other one was the steel industry. And these industries created a significant amount of pollution. This is a picture of the Carnegie Steel Mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I show this to you for personal reasons because when my grandfather came to America, this is where he worked. And my grandmother always complained that whenever she put the wash out, depending on which way the wind was blowing, it would become covered with soot, with dirt from the steel mills. So that, of course, people had to breathe. And in addition to the industrial pollution, there was also a great deal of overcrowding. This photograph is from the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1905. And we are looking at immigrants who have recently arrived from Russia. And they're basically living out in the street because it's so crowded. And it creates unsanitary conditions. It creates a great deal of noise. And it began to change the landscape of the city because residents who already lived there did not like to live in the city anymore because it was too crowded, too dirty, too noisy. So they began to move to the suburbs. And here is an early suburb outside of Boston. Now, the problem with expanding the geography of a metropolitan area is that it takes you much longer to get to work. It takes you much longer to go home. So you need new systems of transportation in order to close the gap because, as we say in America, time is money. And the new system of transportation was the automobile. Now, believe it or not, I am going to tell you something that may be hard to believe, but I swear it is true. When the automobile appeared, it was hailed as the great salvation for the urban environment. Why? Because before the automobile, there was the horse. And horses dropped tons of manure and gallons of urine on city streets every single day. And the urine and the manure attracted flies and insects, and it was extremely unsightly, it was unhealthy, and it smelled a lot. The automobile did not do any of that. It was considered the clean alternative to the horse. And all you needed to do was feed it gasoline. You didn't have to worry about feeding it hay every day. And you would be fine. But as we all know, as it turned out, the automobile became the primary polluter of American cities. And it became the primary polluter in a dangerous way because beginning in the early decades of the 20th century, land in American cities became so expensive that cities had to build up rather than out. This, we are looking at the first skyscraper. It is the Woolworth Building in New York City, built in 1912, 52 stories tall. Interesting fact about the Woolworth Building. The Woolworth Building stands next to where the World Trade Center towers stood. When the World Trade Center towers crumbled as a result of the attack on September 11th, 2001, many of the buildings around the World Trade Center were severely damaged or, in fact, destroyed as well, but not the Woolworth Building, which gives you an idea of how well it was constructed. And back in 1912, it was a great marvel, and it began a race between cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago, who could build the tallest skyscrapers. And of course, New York won the race. This is the construction of the Empire State Building, begun in 1929, which became, at the time, the tallest building in the world. As many of you probably know, Americans like to brag and boast about the tallest buildings, the biggest railroad, and the greatest baseball teams. So this gave Americans bragging rights, at least for a time, building the Empire State Building. But what happens when you build very tall buildings in a small space and you have lots of automobiles below? The air can become trapped. And this is what happened in New York City in 1966. This is a photo from what is called in scientific terms an air inversion. It happens when a low front comes in under a high front and just sits there, and the air does not move. And if the air does not move, it doesn't clear out the exhaust from automobiles. And if it doesn't do that, then you get this effect. And it made many people sick. It killed some people. And I show you this because it led to the first major environmental legislation directed at cities in American history. And that was legislation to take lead out of gasoline, because lead was responsible for a great deal of the pollution from internal combustion engines, the automobile. Now, in the South and the West, cities are much more spread out because they grew up during the automobile era. And so we have a city like Houston, Texas, that is literally ringed by highways. And these highways generate a great deal of pollution. Not only do they generate a great deal of pollution, but they require a significant amount of land use in cities. And so the automobile not only contributes to air pollution, but it contributes to site pollution as well, because of so much land in the center city given over to parking. This is a reflection in many cities of the fact that we in the US have not significantly invested in public transportation. the feeling was, well, everybody has a car. Everybody has a car, so why pay for a tram, or why pay for a bus, or why pay for a subway or metro? But in fact, it's becoming more and more important, as we'll see, to have that option of public transportation. So, beginning in the 1920s, city planners began to look for alternatives. They realized that you cannot ban the automobile. If you banned the automobile, you would have a revolution in America. Probably a lot of other places as well. So, how about designing the city to accommodate the automobile, but at the same time making it safe and healthy for the people? And the first attempt at this was in Radburn, New Jersey, and that's what you're looking at, was in Radburn, New Jersey in 1929. The idea was to separate people traffic from vehicular traffic, to separate people from cars. And as you can see here, the bridge where these children are running and walking, the bridge carries the traffic, but below, on the pathways, reserved only for people. This became a key principle of city planning in America, the separation of pedestrian and vehicular traffic. And here you see on the bottom slide another example of a planning innovation. Many Americans were taught to believe that congestion is bad, that putting houses close to each other is bad. We like to spread out. Like Russia, we're a big country. We have lots of land, so why not use all the land we can use? Well, the problem there is that the more land you use, the more land you lose, which means that in addition to wildlife, you also threaten the ecosystem, and you also threaten the air and water supply as well. So Radburn had two major innovations. In addition to separating vehicular from pedestrian traffic, the planners also made higher density, and you can see the homes are grouped there, higher density, and left the rest of the area of the town as open space, as open space. This is one of my favorite people in American history. Anybody know who this is? This is Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was a biologist for the U.S. government, specifically for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And she is really the beginning of the modern environmental movement in America. She wrote a book in 1962 that I would urgently recommend you read, because it touched off the environmental movement not only in America but around the world as well. And that book was Silent Spring. And the argument in Silent Spring was that to accommodate humans, we have actually made it more threatening for their lives. Because to build settlements, to build cities, to build suburbs, we have used pesticides to kill weeds and unwanted grasses that in turn have found their way into the food chain and have killed other good animals and plants as well. And she predicted that if we continued using these chemicals on farms and in settlements, there would in fact be a silent spring. There would be no birds, no insects, and ultimately no human beings. At the time the book appeared in 1962, there was also another concern, and that was acid rain. It was the height of nuclear testing. The US, along with the Soviet Union, tested nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Now, in both cases, both countries thought that that wouldn't be a problem because they were in very remote areas. But as we know, the upper atmosphere moves very quickly around the world. And as a result, can in fact come down when it rains as acid rain. So the consciousness of Americans about their environment really began to form as a result of the nuclear testing and as a result of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. There were also other incidents in the 1960s. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire. Now, how can a river catch on fire? Because doesn't water put out fires? Well, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was so saturated with chemicals that it really was no longer a living river, but in fact was a chemical dump. And the river caught on fire. And you can see here, this reporter for the Cleveland newspaper put his hand in the river. And you can see the color of his hand. That does not look like river water. So the following year, in 1970, millions of Americans got together for the first time to celebrate Earth Day. Earth Day was a dedication that the national government would pay attention to the environment, and the result was that President Richard Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, charged with protecting the environment, with passing laws to protect the air and to protect the water and to protect the nation's food supply. But good intentions sometimes go bad. And 3 years later, in 1973, we had the Arab oil embargo. And suddenly, Americans couldn't drive. And remember what I said earlier. You take cars away from Americans, and there will be a revolution. So Americans were very unhappy. So any idea about conservation, any idea about environmental protection began to be attacked as harmful to our economy and particularly harmful to generating energy. There were still efforts to create a model community that would be sustainable. And perhaps the best effort in this time, in the 1970s, was a small community on the Gulf Coast of Florida called Seaside, Florida. It was designed by Robert Davis, who was a native of Odessa in Ukraine. And he migrated to America and became a city planner. And his idea was, again, to make density the foundation of settlement. That is, to leave as much open area as possible, while at the same time providing density that would provide good residences, but not bad environments. And to this day, Seaside remains a model of a sustainable community, but it is small, and it's difficult to replicate. Better ideas that can be applied to larger cities have come from several cities, but particularly from New York City. New York City is probably the most environmentally conscious city in the country. And this is partially a result of the administration of Michael Bloomberg during the early 21st century. And I'll give you some examples of what he did in New York. This is, well, you can see it's industrial land, it's residential land, not very attractive. It's on the water by the East River in Brooklyn. And what Mayor Bloomberg did, he said, well, let's knock down some of these structures and let's expand out into the river and create a park. In other words, create more open spaces for the city to breathe. Because that is a good metaphor, because parks generate carbon dioxide. And so in 2013, we have the beginnings of Brooklyn Bridge Park. And you can see that up in the right-hand corner. And today, that park, by 2017, today, that park has now come almost all over the entire area. And it's a lovely place on a spring or summer day to be by the river, get a nice breeze, and have a picnic, take a bottle of wine, and enjoy it. Another innovation of New York City is something called adaptive reuse. That is adapting an old urban form to a new and more sustainable urban form. And what Mayor Bloomberg did and helped with, this on the left was an abandoned elevated railroad track on the west side of Manhattan, prime real estate. Developers wanted to tear it down and build high-rises. Mayor Bloomberg said, no. Let's transform these tracks. Let's transform this railroad into a park. So this elevated railroad now has become, on the right, again in 2013, the High Line Park. And it is now the second most popular tourist destination in New York City. The first is the Empire State Building. And this is the second, the High Line. It's a park that runs elevated, and you get magnificent views of the city from about 14th Street on the west side all the way to 38th Street on the west side, and it ends right at the Hudson River. So you get a magnificent view over the river, and there are nice shops and places to eat. It's just a marvelous place to be. Now, of course, there are other cities that have done very good things with their environment. One of the things that cities did in the early 20th century during the Industrial Revolution was to populate their waterfronts with warehouses and industries, because you could just ship the products very quickly. But of course, that meant a lot of pollution. Well, now we're in the post-industrial era, and we don't need those warehouses and industries any longer. So what cities like Portland, Oregon are doing, they're tearing down the warehouses and industries and putting up flats, putting up apartment buildings, bringing people back to the city center from the suburbs, and making long walks along the river. In other words, returning the river to the people, not to industry, not to warehouses, but to the people. And another innovation has been public transportation. Remember, I told you earlier that cities have not been very interested in investing in public transportation, but now they are, because they understand that the automobile is not, in fact, good for business. In today's professional, high-tech, post-industrial economy, you want to attract young people, innovative people, and they are most interested in cities that are sustainable, that are environmentally conscious. I've done some work in China, and I can tell you the Chinese authorities are very concerned about the fact that their young people, some of their very good young people, are leaving because of the fact that their cities are so polluted. So again, economic development and environmental protection go hand in hand. Now, we still have the automobile, right? And we're still trying to find out what to do with it. Again, Mayor Bloomberg decided, well, what is the most famous space in New York City? Well, it's Times Square. So let's get the automobile out of Times Square and let's make it a pedestrian area. And boy, there were howls. I said, oh no, you can't do that. Well, he did it. And you can see here, this is a picture of Times Square in 2005. And this is Times Square in 2013. And this is 2016. And you see that chair right in the front there? That's where I sit. I'm going to be there another 3 weeks. Now I'm going to sit right there and just enjoy a nice lunch and watch the world go by in the most populous city in America. And you're sitting in the middle of the street, you're breathing clean air, you don't have to worry about automobiles. And of course, one of the innovations in recent years has been the electric car and solar panels. One of the things that President Obama did was to generate tax benefits for people who use solar panels. Our current administration is threatening to end that subsidy. So, How does the U.S. stand with other countries in terms of the use of fossil fuels, nuclear and fossil fuels, and generated by renewable fuels? And as you can see here, the United States ranks pretty low. Brazil and Canada are at the top. Germany does quite well. China, Russia, India, France, Japan, and the United States and South Korea. So Russia beats us at least in one thing. And this is not a good profile, and I'm afraid that it might get worse. The problem is that we have abundant fossil fuels. We have abundant fossil fuel reserves, and the concern is that if we go to other forms of energy, that might have an economic impact on the fossil fuel industry. But this is the way economies go. People who owned horses, who were blacksmiths, they went out of business when the automobile came. When you have innovation, you have what is called creative destruction. That is, some people don't benefit from change, but on the whole, these changes tend to generate a great deal of employment. Another development in cities now are rooftop gardens, transforming rooftops into sustainable vegetable gardens. This happens to be Chicago, but it's common in New York, Los Angeles, and other places as well. And finally, we see that in many places, this happens to be Sunset Park in Brooklyn, for the first time in 150 years, in 1991, this picture was taken in 1991, people could swim in Brooklyn off Sunset Park because it was no longer polluted. So the point is that we have damaged the environment, but we can reverse that damage. So let me conclude by showing you the 10 things we can do right now. In other words, we don't have to wait for new technology or anything like that. 10 things that cities can do right now, to move toward sustainability. Okay. 10. Reduce footprint, convert to electric vehicles. More and more Americans are using hybrids, are using electric vehicles. There's a lot of enthusiasm about the Tesla, for example, but the Detroit car makers, American car makers, also have electric vehicles as well. And as you can see here, I don't have to read it, you can see the amount of savings you can get by using electric vehicles. Okay, 9, living architecture. Architecture is sometimes overlooked as a way of creating sustainable cities. The use of particular materials, the cutting of greenhouse gas emissions, and the cutting of electricity consumption. You can construct from biomaterials, you can reduce harvesting of trees, and in turn revolutionize the cityscape. So it is possible by using good building materials that you can create sustainable buildings. 8, this is very important, and it's becoming more and more in use in American cities. Wireless sensor networks, because they save a great deal. They measure temperature, pollution, radiation, water leaks, full garbage bins, traffic jams. In other words, They can tell you where problems are so you can solve them as quickly as possible. Because you get something like pollution, for example, if it goes over a certain level, you can shut it down or moderate it. So these wireless sensor networks are extremely important to put into cities. 7 and 6. Okay, looking at 7, convert from heating oil to natural gas. This is already underway in American cities. America has an abundance, Russia has an abundance of natural gas. Natural gas is much cleaner than coal. Coal is dirty. Natural gas is much cleaner than oil. If you're going to go to fossil fuels, natural gas is really the best alternative. It's a step toward. It's not the final answer. It's a step toward renewable energy. 6, urban farming. We saw examples of that, not only on rooftops, but also in areas that have been abandoned. 5, green roofs. We noted that as well. It can reduce runoff because it absorbs the water, and runoff is a significant point of pollution, of water pollution in cities. Grassroots initiatives, organizing local cooperatives, start a farmer's market or local community-sponsored agriculture, plan a habitat garden. These are a number of sustainable efforts. You don't have to have broad policies. You can get together with your neighbors and create a sustainable space where you live to grow things. 3, reduce waste. Every major city in America now has recycling. It's mandatory. It's not something that, well, maybe I'll do it, maybe you won't. You have to do it. And we're still pretty far behind Europe, especially the Scandinavian countries. Public transportation, as I mentioned earlier, many cities are getting wise to the fact that public transportation not only helps air pollution, but it is also a great investment in enhancing the profile of your city. We get many young people coming into Charlotte because it's the second largest banking center in America. We get a lot of high-tech people, and they're not interested in buying a car. They're interested in public transportation. And we can say, well, you can live here and just hop on the trolley, the tram, and there you go. So these are the top 10 things to do. Just let me conclude by showing you the top American cities, the cleanest American cities. And we measure that by 5 standards, 5 categories: social environment, air quality, water, energy, and green space. And you can see New York City is in the lead, San Francisco, Boston, Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. What do all these cities have in common? What they have in common is that they attract young, very well-educated people who are innovators, who are active in the high-tech economy, who are professionals, educators, and they are places also where great institutions of higher education exist. This is the future. These cities are the future of America, and they are also the future of our environmental movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I think maybe we could turn the lights back on at this point. We still have some time for questions and answers. So I invite you to not be shy. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My brother is studying this theme exactly, and we're now choosing the university who could proceed in these studies. And I wanted to ask your advice. What are the best universities for studying environmental engineering?
Okay, the question is the best universities to study environmental engineering. Um, well, the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis has a wonderful program, and I will tell you that because my nephew teaches in the program, and it is quite a wonderful program. But there are a number of other universities, New York University, Columbia University, which is located in New York City, also has a very good environmental engineering program. One of the best, besides those that I've mentioned, is at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So those would be my top places.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yes, sir.
Thanks for the lecture. My question is, you mentioned urban farming.
Mhm.
You also mentioned density is the key to using less space, destroying less nature. Also, I saw a lecture by Edward Duany, who will know him, an American architect.
Mhm.
He insists that industrial farming is the key to solving all those problems and using less land and so on. So what does urban farming achieve? Because it's far less productive. Is it a hobby or just a matter of hobby and comfort in the city or what?
I would say that industrial farming is, if it's not the number one polluter in America, it's the number two polluter. So anyone who tells you that industrial farming is the answer is being paid by the industrial farm organizations. Um, no, the fact of urban farming is that it's organic. It does not use chemicals, and it is a way to use the land that is not being used for development in a way that will not only generate revenue for the residents, but also generate lots of good things for the air. It is not something that will replace agriculture so much as it adds to the green space of the city. I mean, if we're going to have green space in the city, we might as well make it productive green space. We're not going to turn Central Park into a farm, but at the same time, we can use land in a creative way, and this is how the rooftop movement. I mean, look at the advantage of rooftop gardens. First of all, they look nice. Secondly, they return that they clean the air. Third, they provide food. And four, they prevent runoff. And runoff is one of the most significant sources of pollution. So just rooftop gardens alone, you're not going to feed millions of people, but it has an impact on the environment, a positive impact.
When you say cleaning the air and providing food, it does sound suspicious.
Why does it sound suspicious cleaning the air?
How does it clean the air? Where does the dust go?
Well, Of course, New York City, for example, is not an industrial city. Um, it cleans the air because the chemical processes of plants uh, give off carbon dioxide and take in recycle the pollution and then take it out. The process of photosynthesis and other processes of plants make these plants not only tasty but also good for the air.
Thanks, David. I also have a question. Thanks for a great lecture.
Thank you.
My question is about the rating of the cities.
Mhm.
So there was no Los Angeles in the list.
No.
How can you comment on this? So do you consider this as a highly polluted city?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I'll elaborate on that. The question was, how come Los Angeles was not on the list? Um, Los Angeles has a problem, has two problems. One is a natural problem. If you look at the geography of Los Angeles, there's the sea, and then there's the mountains, and in between is this valley called Los Angeles. And what happens is that the breeze comes in off the sea and hits the mountains and just stays there, which means that whatever pollution is generated stays there as well. It's called an air inversion, and it happens frequently in Los Angeles. And the second problem in Los Angeles is that, interestingly enough, in the 1930s, Los Angeles had a wonderful public transportation system, but they discontinued it to rely on the car. The auto manufacturers had a very big lobby, and they prevailed. And Los Angeles became a city of large distances. So everybody had to have a car. If you had no public transportation, how do you get about? And combined with the air inversion problem and the car, you have a significant issue. Now, it's to Los Angeles' credit that they are opening up a subway, a metro. The problem in Los Angeles is that it's prone to earthquakes. And some people don't want to ride underground because if there's an earthquake, that's not a good place to be. So they have an image problem there. They're trying to improve their bus system. But in terms of quality of air, I would invite all of you to spend a few days in New York and then spend a few days in Los Angeles, and you could actually feel the difference, particularly if you do any exercise, if you go running in each of those cities. It will affect you. There is no question about it. Now, San Francisco, on the other hand, which was on my list, 23% of commuters in San Francisco use public transportation. That is the second high next to New York in the country. And in Los Angeles, it's less than 3%. So just to give you an example, of the difference. So that's why Los Angeles is not on the list.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Good.
And the comment. The comment is, I think there was a very good correlation that you made between the environmental situation in the city and the way the city does economically, and that there is a clear link between them. And while you were showing the last table, I just Googled the top US cities by GDP, and most of the cities that you have in that list that do fantastically well environmentally, they are in the top 10, like New York, San Francisco, Washington, and some others. And I think this is something that we should all keep in mind. And that leads to my question, because you mentioned several times that this idea is often alien to city administrations and to governments, especially the recent administration seems to not be very sort of caring about environmental issues. And yet you also mentioned that in the US this is a prerogative of states. It's not the federal legislations that dictates the environmental policy. So my question is, in what way do you think the position of the current US government could be detrimental to the sustainable development of the country?
That's a great question, Vera. The current administration can, in fact, be very detrimental in the following ways. Detrimental to cities and states. You're absolutely right. Cities and states can make their own environmental regulations. And California, for example, they have stronger environmental regulations than the federal environmental regulations. That's perfectly okay under our system of government. But what a federal agency like the Environmental Protection Agency does is monitor regulations. Not only regulate, but they monitor compliance with regulations. And when the president says he's going to cut the Environmental Protection Agency by 35%, it means you are going to have less opportunity to monitor, to see if cities and states that are less concerned about the environment are going to comply with the federal regulations. So that is certainly a problem. A second issue is that the federal government has the opportunity to lease federal lands for exploitation for oil, for coal, natural gas, these types of non-renewable resources. And particularly for offshore oil drilling. The problem with offshore oil drilling is that, I mean, people can tell you otherwise, but accidents will happen. And they've already happened. And when these accidents happen, they are devastating to wildlife, and they are ultimately devastating to the communities that are adjacent to them. So these are ways the federal government can really set back. The third way is that federal government provides research funds to research climate change, to research the impact of the rising oceans because of the melting of the ice, both in Antarctica and in the Arctic. And this research has been very productive in devising a number of policies. Today, as we speak, there are areas of southern Florida that are becoming inundated by seawater. That is, the seawater is seeping into the groundwater. And of course, when that happens, your water supply, I mean, you can't drink seawater. The water supply is gone. So there is absolute evidence that climate change is occurring. And what this current administration is proposing is to end funding of research that relates to issues dealing with climate change. And that can be detrimental as well. So there is really a whole list of things that not only will stop sustainable cities and nations, but will actually begin to reverse.
I was also thinking while you were talking that another point why that could be detrimental is that that could impact international agreements, which is extremely important to kind of develop towards sustainability globally, because we cannot do it on our own, and it's the nations agreeing on certain principles and agreeing to incorporate those principles into their national strategies that we can actually achieve results. Otherwise, it still remains very local. So I guess that might also have a certain impact.
You bring up a very important point: international agreements. The Paris Accords of December, this past December. It is very difficult. It will be very difficult for the U.S. to withdraw from them. There are just too many roadblocks and obstacles to do that. But we can withdraw in effect by not complying with the protocols established. And that, of course, can be very dangerous, because if we say we're not going to comply, then why should other countries comply? The second thing is that China now is assuming the world leadership in environmental consciousness. Now, how's that? I mean, if you go to China, it is the most polluted, and I've been going pretty much on an annual basis, and it is really extremely polluted. But they are trying, and they have set 2030 as a target date for changing over to renewable energy. So the Chinese now are the #1 manufacturers of solar panels. If you want to have a solar panel in your house in the U.S., you're getting your solar panels from China, because our president is ending the subsidy for manufacturing solar panels. So who do you think is going to come in and fill that gap? So this is an area where the Chinese can say we're now the world's leaders on this. And of course that means influence in other countries, because China has a very large environmental footprint, as we all know. But at least they're trying to do something about it.
Any more questions? No? Well, I think then we'll probably thank David.
Thank you all. Appreciate you coming. Thanks.
David, may I ask a contact for my brother.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Let me give you my card, sure.
And you know, also I wanted to ask you a question. He is now at A levels in England, in the UK.
Right.
And we are trying to find an internship for summer. Do you think it is possible with his age? Because he's 17.
That might be difficult.
Really?
That might be difficult. But have him contact me, and my nephew probably would know that
Thank you so much.
better.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
It's a really beautiful theme.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for visiting us. Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
But this is very different. I was thinking, did you notice
What Dylan is watching is actually making a good point. I wonder why is this not so widely known. One thing is the density. I come from a scientific city. You could have heard about this city. So there was a modernistic a new town built outside of the big city, or I don't know, it's a great place to live. I lived in the very center. There, I found an apartment, and yeah, it's very nice. Except it's kind of not so intensive, not dense. We did count pedestrians on the streets once, and it looks like the shape of the grass is the same as in the suburbs here on the outskirts. Everybody comes to the store and then comes to the store, buys food, and goes home.
I finally have the list
Not so much activity. So the green activists there are just mad. And they do not allow any tree being cut. We have a problem with Canadian maple tree. It's growing everywhere, just quickly. In 5 years, it's just huge bushes.
And we sent over the DVT of the film, so
I don't know what's its name, but it's native to Russia. It has branches like this. It goes and they make like a skirt. It's very convenient to throw bags with garbage underneath. People walk, and it's like people don't like littering on their feet. And it's visible. They like to throw it so that it flies down the bridge or in the pit, or like, oh, nobody saw that. So I was writing that, like, look, there are bushes and it's not being cut. Trees were not cut for years. Why don't you came? And I say, like, look, we have a sidewalk that's crossing the all this undefined space and bushes
I wonder if they, I wonder if they
overgrown.
know weed is
There's a lot of litter.
screened as well.
And there's one of them serves as a toilet. And I say, look, we have to at least trim them. No, you're fighting for
I'll have to ask, because we're also in touch with
stone
Stroke,
jungle.
we're bringing some of their summer
So
speakers.
I could explain it only to one of them. Say, like, look, we have
So I'll actually grab
multiple
his
streets
code.
and street retail in this other place. We don't need anything. We have less traffic in other places. And if we trim the trees just like 3 meters from the sidewalk, then people found an area there. There's a lawn which is mowed, and there's very little garbage. And just next to it, bushes begin, and everybody throws there. Just make it just 3 meters of buffer, and that's it. Then people stop doing this.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you too. Good luck.
You got my camera?
Yes, I have it right here.
You're going to take it and sell it on eBay, right?
No, I just didn't want to misplace it, so I stuck it in my safe place. Did you want to grab the water for the ride, or?
Yeah, can I do that?
Yeah.
Okay,
In fact,
they
if
won't
you want
mind me
no.
taking.
Might as well take it in case you need it for something. I can hold it if you want.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So Rena was just going outside. Our driver should be coming.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, in just a few minutes. So that was excellent.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
It's great. And Vera was just saying this is like the best turnout they've had, really. And environmental topics don't usually bring big crowds, so a lot of people are interested.
Good.
And so I'll look up the YouTube video.
Yeah, if you could give me the link, yeah, that would be,
Yeah.
that'd be great.
I'd love
I'll
to.
send you the link to my daughter's show.
Yeah, good. And I'm sure our embassy social media would want to share the video as well. So
Sure. Feel free to share it all over the place.
That's
Yeah.
great. Thanks.
Yeah. Sure.
It's interesting affair. Probably didn't take too many pictures. I could probably take like 5 or so. From different angles. You can really see.
That's cool. I appreciate that.
No, that's what I'm here for. I take my own pictures. Yeah, I think Alina is trying to sell them a car. So I just want to make sure
Мы за ним следите, мы пришли с школы баллистики. Вот. У нас мы регулярно ходим здесь по средам из ВКонтакте, действительно, школы баллистики. Перед завтраком и на YouTube роликсы. Да, да, она уже доступна. Вот перевод. Умный.
Некоторые, кто английский плохо знают, могут не так понять некоторые слова. Наоборот.